Once upon a time in the village of Umoji, there was a woman so beautiful that men forgot their own names when they saw her. Her name was Isime. Her skin was smooth like fresh palm oil. Her eyes sparkled like morning dew, and her smile, oh, her smile could melt the heart of even the angriest man. Men whispered about her beauty. Women envied her charm. Whenever she walked through the market, traders forgot their prices. Men dropped whatever they were holding, and even the birds in the trees seemed to pause and watch. One old woman sighed and shook her head. "This kind of beauty is dangerous," she murmured. But Isime was not just beautiful. She was wise. She knew the power she had over men, and she knew how to keep them at a distance. No touching before marriage, she always said. Every man Isime met, she always insisted that there would be no intimacy before marriage. Men saw this as a sign of dignity. They respected her. They praised her for her virtue. But Isime knew the truth. This was not about dignity. This was about her secret, a secret she had carried all her life. If a man ever touched her, if a man ever saw what was between her thighs, he would never be the same again. So she smiled. She laughed. She let them admire her from afar, but she never let any man too close. And that was how she lived. Until Emeka, a handsome young man, came into her life. Emeka was a good man, a man with a heart as pure as fresh palm wine. He was kind, he was hardworking, and he loved Isime like no man had ever loved before. From the first time he saw her at the village stream, he was lost. His heart beat fast, his legs felt weak. This one, he told himself, this is the woman I will marry. And so he chased after her. He bought her gifts, fine wrappers, sweet palm wine, and fresh bush meat. He sang her praises. He whispered sweet words. "Isime, you are the light of my world." And Isime? She smiled. She laughed. But she did not let him get too close. No touching before marriage, she reminded him, as she did all men. Emeka did not mind. "You are a good woman," he said, his heart swelling with love. "I will wait." For months, they courted. The village watched. The village gossiped. Finally, our Isime will marry. And then, one bright afternoon, Emeka went to her father's house with his people. He knelt before her and said, "Marry me, Isime. Be the mother of my children." Isime smiled. She liked Emeka. He was gentle and he made her laugh. But deep inside, fear gripped her heart. "Still," she said, "yes, I will marry you." The village rejoiced. Drummers played, women danced, children ran around shouting her name. "Isime the beautiful is getting married," they sang. The wedding was grand. Even the oldest men in the village said they had never seen such a feast. But the real night had not yet come. When the celebration ended and the last candle burned low, Isime and Emeka were alone. The room was quiet, only the sound of crickets outside. Emeka held her hands and whispered, "My love, don't be afraid. You are mine now." Isime's heart pounded. She knew this moment would come. Her hands trembled as she stepped back. "Emeka, maybe we should sleep first. We are tired," she said, her voice shaking. Emeka laughed. "Sleep? My wife, don't be shy. I have waited for this night. I will love you gently." Isime swallowed hard. She knew there was no escape. Hesitant and shaking, she finally pulled off her clothes. The moment Emeka set his eyes on what lay between her thighs, he let out a loud scream. Then, in the blink of an eye, he went blind. "Ah, my eyes, my eyes." Emeka's voice rang through the night. He clutched his face and staggered back. Isime froze. "What is it? What is wrong?" she cried. But Emeka could not hear her. His world had turned black. Just like that, his eyes had gone blind. His screams woke the entire village. People ran into the house, elders, women, even the children. "What happened? What is wrong with him?" they asked. But Emeka only wailed. He pointed at Isime, shaking, his mouth open in horror. But he could not see her anymore. The elders whispered among themselves. The villagers looked at Isime with suspicion, but nobody could explain what had happened. The next morning, Isime packed her things and left. She did not cry. She did not explain. She just left Emeka behind, his eyes forever dark, his future forever changed. Her secret was still safe, but fate was not done with her yet. Not long after Emeka's mysterious blindness, whispers about Isime filled the village like harmattan dust. Some said she was cursed, others said Emeka had fallen sick from an unknown disease, but no one knew the truth, and Isime carried on with her life as if nothing had happened. Then, a few months later, Isime met another man. His name was Ejike. Ejike was not like Emeka. He was richer, stronger, and more powerful. His father was a great chief, and his mother came from a long line of wealthy traders. Ejike himself had businesses in many towns. He had horses, farms, and enough gold to make even the king jealous. When he first saw Isime, his heart skipped a beat. "Who is that woman?" he asked his friend at the market. "That is Isime," the friend replied, "the most beautiful woman in Umoji. But be careful, my brother. There is a mystery about her." Ejike laughed. "What mystery?" "A woman. This beautiful cannot be dangerous. I will marry her." And so, Ejike began to chase Isime like a hunter after a deer. He sent gifts to her house, cloths from faraway lands, beads that sparkled like the stars, and bags of rice big enough to feed a whole family for a year. But Isime, as always, smiled sweetly and said, "No touching before marriage." Ejike loved this about her. A woman of virtue, a woman who respects herself. This is the kind of wife I need. Before long, he asked for her hand in marriage. The wedding was grander than Emeka's. Drummers played until their hands ached. Dancers moved their bodies until sweat covered their skin. People came from far and wide to witness the marriage of Ejike the rich and Isime the beautiful. Even the king sent his messengers with gifts. But when the sun went down and the guests went home, the real night began. Ejike and Isime sat in their new home, a big house with high walls and fine furniture. Candles flickered in the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Ejike pulled her close and whispered, "My wife, my love, this night belongs to us. Don't be afraid." Isime's hands grew cold. Her heart beat like the village drum. She tried to move away, but Ejike only laughed and kissed her forehead. "Are you shy? Don't worry, you are mine now." Isime took a deep breath. There was no escape. Slowly, she removed her clothes. At first, Ejike froze. His eyes widened. His chest rose and fell as he took in the sight before him. Just as Ejike's eyes fell upon her secret of what's between her thighs, he opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He lost his voice instantly. Ejike's face twisted in horror. He clutched his throat. His lips moved, but nothing came. He tried again. Nothing. His voice was gone. Panic filled his eyes as he turned to Isime, pointing, trying to speak, but no words came. His whole body shook as he grabbed his ears. A ringing sound, loud, sharp, endless. Then, silence. Ejike could not hear. He could not speak. Fear gripped his body like a spirit had entered him. He stumbled backward, hitting the wooden stool. He ran to the door, pushing it open, rushing into the night. Outside, some of his family members were still sitting around, drinking palm wine and laughing. When they saw Ejike, they stood up in confusion. "Ejike, what is wrong?" one of his uncles asked. Ejike pointed at his mouth, then at his ears. He tried to speak, but no words came. He shook his head, slapped his own ears, waved his hands frantically. "Why is he acting like this?" someone whispered. The people gathered. The drummers stopped drumming. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting. "Ejike, talk to us. What happened?" Ejike opened his mouth again. Silence. Someone shouted, "He has lost his voice." Another said, "He cannot hear us." Murmurs filled the air. Whispers. Suspicion. Fear. Isime stood at the door, watching. Her heart was racing. The villagers were staring at her now. This is not ordinary. An elder finally said, "First, Emeka lost his sight. Now Ejike has lost his voice and hearing. Something is wrong. Something is very wrong." Ejike's mother fell to the ground wailing, "My son! My son! Who did this to you?" The people turned to Isime. Isime shook her head. "I don't know what happened. I swear, I don't know." But nobody believed her. That night, Ejike's family took him to many herbalists. They made sacrifices, they prayed, they begged the gods. But his voice never returned. His hearing never came back. The next morning, Isime packed her things and left. She did not cry. She did not explain. She simply walked away. Her secret was still hidden. But the villagers were talking now. This was not a coincidence. This was a curse, and fate was not done with her yet. By now, Isime's name carried whispers wherever she went. People spoke in hushed tones when they saw her pass. 2 men, one blind, one mute, and deaf. Yet no one could prove anything. Some said it was bad luck. Some said it was the work of spirits, but no one had the courage to speak to her directly. Then came Obinna. Obinna was not just rich, he was the richest man in all of Umoji. His father owned lands, his mother owned markets, and Obinna himself had enough money to buy anything or anyone he wanted. Women in the village dreamed of becoming his wife. Mothers prayed for him to choose their daughters. But Obinna wanted only one woman, Isime. When he saw her, his heart jumped like a frog in hot water. "This is the woman I have been waiting for," he declared to his friends. "No one else compares." His friends hesitated. One of them scratched his head and said, "Obinna, have you not heard? Emeka went blind. Ejike cannot speak or hear. They both married Isime." Obinna laughed, a deep, rich laugh that shook his belly. "So because 2 weak men lost their senses, I should be afraid. Do you think I am like them? I am Obinna. I have money. I have power. Nothing can happen to me." And just like that, he went after Isime. He showered her with gifts, boxes of gold, the finest clothes from across the rivers, slaves to serve her. He built her a house before she even said yes. And when he finally asked, Isime agreed. The whole village gathered for their wedding. It was bigger than any wedding before it. Goats were slaughtered. Palm wine flowed like river water. Musicians played until their fingers bled. "This time, it will be different," the villagers whispered. "Obinna is not like the others." But when the sun went down and the last drumbeat faded, the real night began. The wedding night. Obinna and Isime stood inside the finest hotel in the town. The bed was covered in white sheets. The air smelled of fresh flowers. The candles flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Obinna smiled. He was ready. He held Isime's hands. "My love, you are now my wife. Tonight, nothing will come between us." Isime's heart pounded. Her hands turned cold. Her legs felt weak. She had seen this before. The same night, the same moment, the same fear. She tried to move away, but Obinna only laughed. "Don't be shy, my wife. You belong to me now." Isime took a deep breath. No escape. Slowly and hesitant, she removed her clothes. Already high in the mood, Obinna reached for her. But as he undressed her, he felt something strange. Confused, he turned on the main lights, and the moment he saw what lay between her thighs, he let out a loud, terrifying scream. His voice echoed through the entire hotel. There, between Isime's thighs, were two female private parts, one in the usual place and a smaller one slightly below it. It was an unnatural sight, something beyond human understanding. Obinna stumbled backward, his face twisted in horror. "What? What is this?" he gasped. His legs wobbled. He stumbled back, knocking over a wooden chair. His heart was racing like a drum in a war song. Then, a knock at the door. "Obinna, what is happening?" More knocks. Then, the door burst open. Obinna's family, his friends, his servants, they all rushed in. The villagers rushed in. And for the first time, Isime's secret was no longer hers alone. The bitter truth was revealed, and the long-kept secret was exposed to the whole world. Isime was so ashamed of herself, and people around her started calling her a witch and a bad-luck human being. Someone made a remark. Who knows, maybe she wanted to kill Obinna. The words were too harsh for her to bear as she began to tremble. Another person said, "We don't want to hear anything from you, killer. Who sent you?" Isime trembled in fear and shame as she began to speak. Obinna, still trembling and gasping for breath, suddenly coughed. Blood trickled from his mouth. His eyes bulged in horror, and within moments, he collapsed. His body convulsed violently before he breathed his last. The entire village stood in shock. The man who had just been celebrating his wedding hours ago was now dead. Isime lay on the cold floor, her hands shaking, her face wet with tears. The crowd roared above her, their voices sharp like knives. She is a witch. She has deceived Obinna. She killed him. Isime covered her ears. The voices were too loud. The words were too heavy. She wanted to scream, to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare. But she couldn't. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she lifted her head. Her lips trembled. Her voice was weak. "Please, let me speak." "We don't want to hear anything from you, evil woman," someone shouted. "She must have used charms to trap Obinna." Isime shut her eyes, took a deep breath, and then she spoke. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice cracking. The room fell silent. "I was born this way. I never knew. I swear, I never knew." The villagers stared, their eyes filled with doubt and anger. But Isime continued. "I was just 5 years old when my mother died," she whispered. The crowd murmured. Then the truth began to unfold. Many years ago, before Isime knew the meaning of pain, before she learned how to smile to hide her sorrow, she was just a little girl, a baby. Her father was a rich man with 6 wives. His house was full of children, but only one daughter, Isime. Her mother, Neka, was the youngest wife. She was beautiful and kind, but the other wives hated her. Not because she was the favorite, not because she was younger. They hated her because she gave birth to a girl. In the household, boys were everything. Boys carried the family name. Boys inherited the land. Boys were celebrated. But a girl was nothing. Isime's 5 stepmothers looked at her with jealousy and hatred. Why must she be the only one with a daughter? Mama Nkechi, the second wife, hissed. We have given birth to sons, but look how happy our husband is because of this girl. Mama Ijoma, the third wife, spat. But the worst of them all was the first wife, Mama Chidi. She was the oldest, the most powerful among the wives, and the most dangerous. Her heart was blacker than the darkest night. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Mama Chidi made a terrible decision. This girl will never know happiness, she whispered. I will make sure of it. She swallowed hard. One evening, my mother drank palm wine, but she never woke up. They said it was the gods, but I know the truth. She was poisoned. The people gasped. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads. After she died, my stepmothers turned me into a slave. I woke up before the sun and slept long after the moon had risen. I fetched water, cooked, cleaned, washed their clothes, and yet I was never allowed to eat enough food. They made me sleep on the cold kitchen floor while their sons lay on soft mats. Isime's voice broke, but she kept going. I smiled, I laughed, I believed one day things would change. She paused, her chest rising and falling. But I did not know, she whispered, that they had done something terrible to me when I was just a baby. The crowd held their breath. The elders leaned in closer. Isime wiped her tears. I never knew until tonight. Then the truth continues to surface. A long time ago, while Isime was still a little girl, deep in the heart of the forest, there lived a wicked herbalist. His heart was dark, his eyes red like burning coal, and his voice was as dry as harmattan wind. People feared him. They said he could turn a man into a goat with just a whisper. One night, when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, Mama Chidi crept into the forest, carrying a black clay pot. Her wrapper was tied tight around her chest, her feet bare, her eyes full of wickedness. She walked deep into the forest, where the air smelled of rotten leaves and spirits whispered through the trees. When she reached the old herbalist's hut, she knocked 3 times. Who dares disturb me at this hour? A voice growled from inside. It is me, Great One, Mama Chidi said, her voice shaking. I need your help. The door creaked open, and the herbalist peered at her with his red, shining eyes. His teeth were yellow like old bones. Speak, he said. Mama Chidi stepped forward and whispered, I want to ruin her life forever. The herbalist's lips curled into a wicked smile. He laughed, a sound like dry leaves crackling in fire. A baby? He asked, tilting his head. You wish to curse a child? Mama Chidi nodded. You are more wicked than I thought, the herbalist chuckled. Then he turned, picked up a wooden bowl, and began to mix. He crushed dark leaves, poured thick black oil, and whispered strange words. The room grew colder, the air heavier. Then he dipped his fingers into the bowl and smeared a dark potion onto a small cloth. He turned to Mama Chidi. Take this, he said. Rub it on the baby every night. Slowly, the curse will grow. She will carry shame for the rest of her life. Mama Chidi grinned. She took the cloth, tied it inside her wrapper, and hurried back home before the first rooster crowed. From that night, when everyone was asleep, she tiptoed into Isime's mother's room. The baby lay peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling. Mama Chidi unwrapped the cursed cloth and rubbed the dark potion on Isime's soft skin. Night after night, she did the same, whispering, rubbing, cursing. The curse grew, and by the time Isime turned 5, It was complete, but nobody knew, not even Isime herself. Now, standing in the middle of the hotel room, her face soaked with tears, she whispered, "I didn't know. I swear, I never knew." The villagers stared at her, their eyes wide with shock. The elders shook their heads. Her curse had been given to her before she even had a choice. But what could she do now? The whole village knew, and they were not ready to forgive. The sky was dark, but the village was awake. Torches burned bright, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was thick with anger, voices rising like thunder. "She is a witch! She has brought death to our people!" someone shouted. "She is cursed! She must leave this village!" another voice cried. The whole village gathered in the square, their faces twisted with fear and hatred. Children clung to their mothers, elders shook their heads, and the warriors stood ready, holding sticks and stones. In the middle of it all stood Isime. Her body shook, her eyes burned with unshed tears. Her feet felt heavy, like stones were tied to them. She turned to her father, her own father, the man she had called Papa since she was a child. He stood at the front, his arms folded, his face expressionless. His eyes did not meet hers. He did not say a word. "Papa, please." Isime's voice cracked, but he did not move. He did nothing. Isime's heart shattered. The elders stepped forward. Their faces were grim. "This girl has brought misfortune to our village. 3 men have suffered because of her. One is blind, one is mute, one is dead. We cannot allow this evil to remain among us." The people cheered in agreement. One elder raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. "Isime is a disgrace. She must be banished." Isime fell to her knees. "Please, I didn't do anything. I didn't know," she sobbed. But no one listened. A strong man grabbed her arm. Another grabbed the other. They dragged her forward. Isime screamed, "Papa, help me!" But her father turned away. Her own blood had abandoned her. Tears blurred her vision. The crowd spit at her, threw sand at her. The first stone hit her back, then another, then another. She ran. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her. The village gates opened, and the moment she stepped past them, they slammed shut. She was no longer one of them. She was an outcast. The forest she ran into was dark and cold. The trees whispered secrets to the wind. The night creatures called to each other. Isime stumbled through the thick bushes, her feet bleeding, her arms covered in bruises. The pain in her heart was worse than the pain in her body. Why me?" she whispered to the wind. She walked for hours, not knowing where she was going. She was tired, hungry, cold. At last, her legs gave out and she collapsed by the root of an old tree. Her stomach growled. Her lips were dry. She had nothing, no food, no water, no home. Tears slid down her face as she curled up on the cold ground. She had lost everything: her home, her family, her name. Her world had ended, but she did not know. Fate was not done with her yet. Isime walked and walked. Days passed. Her feet were swollen, her lips were cracked, her stomach cried for food. The forest was endless. Tall trees blocked the sun. Shadows danced on the ground. Strange sounds came from deep in the bushes. Whispers, rustling leaves, the call of unseen creatures. She drank from small streams. She ate wild fruits, but they were bitter, and some made her stomach turn. She had never been this alone. At night, the cold wrapped around her like a wicked spirit. She shivered, hugging herself, whispering, "Why me? What have I done?" But the forest did not answer. One evening, just as the sky turned red like fire, Isime saw it. A small mud hut hidden between two giant trees. Smoke curled from the thatched roof, a sign of life. With her last strength, she dragged herself to the door and knocked. There was a long silence. Then the door creaked open. An old woman stood there. Her eyes were sharp, her face wrinkled like old leather. Her silver hair hung in long, thin braids. She held a wooden staff, and around her neck were cowrie shells that jingled softly. She looked at Isime once, just one look, and her eyes widened. "My child." Her voice was deep and slow. "You carry a curse." Isime's heart stopped. "Please, help me, Mama. I have nowhere else to go." The woman stepped aside. "Come inside, child." Inside the hut, warmth wrapped around Isime. A small fire burned in the corner. Pots of herbs hung from the ceiling, and the air smelled of smoke and ancient secrets. The woman handed her a wooden bowl of hot soup. "Eat, you need strength." Isime ate quickly, the hot liquid burning down her throat, filling her empty belly. When she was done, the woman sat across from her, her eyes never leaving Isime's face. "Tell me, child, how did you end up in this forest?" And so Isime told her everything. She spoke of Emeka's blindness, Ejike's silence, and Obina's death. She told her of the anger of the villagers, how they had cast her out, how her own father had turned away from her. And as she spoke, tears ran down her face. The old woman nodded slowly. Then she placed her hands on Isime's forehead and closed her eyes. She whispered words too soft to hear. The fire in the hut flickered. The air became still. When she opened her eyes again, they were filled with knowing. "It was your stepmothers. They did this to you." Isime's breath caught in her throat. "My stepmothers? But why?" The woman sighed. "Jealousy, wickedness." Their hearts were black with envy. They did not want you to be happy, so they cursed you before you even knew yourself. Isime's hands curled into fists. She remembered the whispers behind her back as a child, the way they made her suffer, the way they treated her mother like nothing. Everything made sense now. "They took everything from me," Isime shouted. "My happiness, my life. They left me with nothing." Her body shook with rage. Then she stood up. Her voice was steady. Her heart was strong. "I must go back," she said. "I must face them." The old woman smiled. "Yes, child, it is time for the truth to come out." Isime walked with purpose. She was no longer the scared woman who had run into the forest. She was different now, stronger, wiser, ready. The old woman, Ejira, walked beside her, holding her wooden staff. The forest had once swallowed Isime, but now it had given her back. The village came into view. The place that had cast her out now stood before her. She took a deep breath. No fear, no turning back. It was time for the truth. The villagers saw her before she even reached the square. "She has returned," someone shouted. People ran out of their homes, staring, whispering. "Didn't we banish her? How is she still alive?" But Isime did not stop. She walked straight to the elder's hut. The oldest men in the village, the ones who had banished her, sat in a circle, talking about village matters. When they saw her, they froze. The chief elder stood up. "Isime, what are you doing here? You are no longer one of us." Isime's voice was steady, clear, unshaken. "I have come for justice. I have come for the truth." The elders frowned. The villagers gathered around, curious, confused. Then her stepmothers arrived. Mama Nkechi, Mama Ijeoma, the others. And at the front, Mama Chidi, the wicked one. Their faces went pale when they saw Isime. She turned to them, her eyes burned with anger. "You cursed me," she said. The crowd gasped. The stepmothers looked at one another, fear creeping into their eyes. Mama Chidi forced a laugh. "What is this girl saying? Has she run mad in the forest?" Isime did not blink. She lifted her chin and said, "You went to a herbalist. You used black powder on me when I was a baby. You turned me into this." Silence. The people turned to the elders. The elders turned to the stepmothers. "Is this true?" one elder asked. Before they could deny it, Ejira stepped forward. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather pouch. She opened it and let the black powder spill into her palm. The same black powder that had cursed Isime. The evidence, the proof. The villagers gasped. Mama Chidi's face turned white like ashes. Her hands trembled. I don't know what this is." But Ejire was not finished. She raised her staff and spoke words of old, words that only the wise knew. The fire in the elder's hut flickered, swayed, then roared to life. The villagers staggered back in shock, and in that moment, Mama Chidi fell to the ground. Her body shook, her mouth opened, but no words came out. The elders stepped forward, their faces filled with horror. "You did this to a baby?" one of them whispered. Mama Chidi began to cry. She fell on her knees. "Please, forgive me." But the villagers were not ready to forgive. "This woman has destroyed an innocent life. She has brought a curse upon our village. She must be punished." Then someone picked up a stone. Then another, and another. Mama Chidi screamed. The first stone hit her shoulder. The second one hit her back. More stones, more anger, more voices rising in rage. Isime watched without blinking. This was the woman who had cursed her, the woman who had ruined her life, and now she was paying for it. Mama Chidi's screams faded. Her body fell still. The stone stopped. She was dead. The villagers turned to the other stepmothers. Their faces were full of fear. They fell to their knees, begging, "Please, we only followed her. It was her idea." But the elders shook their heads. "You watched it happen. You let it happen. You will not live among us anymore." And just like that, they were banished. Just like Isime had been. Only now, they had nowhere to go. The curse had been broken, but Isime's heart was still heavy. Would she ever be whole again? Would she ever be free? Only time would tell. The village had spoken. Justice had been served. The women who had cursed her were gone. Their whispers had turned into screams, and their evil had led them to their fate. But even though Isime had found the truth, even though the village now saw her as a victim, not a monster, she knew one thing: she could never stay. This place was no longer her home. The streets where she once laughed as a child were now filled with memories of pain. The voices that once praised her beauty had cursed her name. She had been banished once, and though they had welcomed her back, she knew she could never be truly free here. So, one early morning, before the sun could rise, before the village could see her leave, Isime walked away. She traveled far, through forests, over rivers, past villages where no one knew her face. And when she found a place where the wind smelled different, where the trees did not whisper her name, where no one looked at her with fear or pity, she stopped. This would be her new home. At first, life was hard. She had nothing, but Isime was not weak. She had survived too much to give up now. She worked. She learned. She built herself from nothing. And as the months turned to years, she grew strong. Her past no longer chained her. Her heart no longer ached with fear. Isime was free, and then, one day, she met him, a man, not like Emeka, not like Ejike, not like Obina. He had gentle eyes and a quiet strength. He did not chase her with gold and riches. He did not praise her beauty alone. He saw her scars and loved her anyway. And for the first time in her life, Isime allowed herself to love. This time, her wedding was different. No drum shaking the sky. No hundreds of eyes watching, waiting for something to go wrong. No whispers. It was small, simple, peaceful. She wore a white cloth tied softly around her waist. She held her husband's hands, and when he said, "I love you," Isime believed it. And this time, when she removed her clothes on the wedding night, nothing happened. No screams, no blindness, no death. Because for the first time in her life, she was truly free. The curse was gone. Months passed. Then came the day that changed everything. Isime cried and screamed as the midwives surrounded her, their hands warm, their voices soothing. "Push, Isime, push!" She had never known pain like this, but she had also never known joy like this. Because when it was over, when the cries filled the room, the midwives gasped. Isime had given birth to 4 children, quadruplets, 2 boys, 2 girls. She held them close, tears slipping down her face. She had lost so much, but now she had gained even more. Back in her old village, the people still spoke of her, the girl who was cursed, the girl who lost everything, the girl who disappeared. But they never understood how she won, because Isime was no longer a girl to be pitied. She was a woman who had conquered fate. She had survived, and in the end, she had won. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, please like the video, comment what you learned from the tale, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enchanting tales just like this one. Thank you.